So, get this, for 14 years, from 1777 to 1791, the plucky little Republic of Vermont was its own thing. Not American, not British, it was just Vermont. And during that time, its leaders, guys like Ethan Allen and his brother Ira, were in secret talks with the British governor in Quebec. They were seriously considering rejoining the British Empire and becoming part of what would eventually be Canada. Imagine that. A world where Burlington is just another stop on the way to Montreal. And Bernie Sanders would have been a member of Parliament. It's one of those fantastic what-ifs of history that shows you how incredibly fluid and uncertain everything was back then. The lines on the map we take for granted were just suggestions, and national identity was a very new, very weird idea. This whole Vermont situation is the perfect opener because it completely shatters our modern view of the US-Canada relationship. We see this clean, straight border and assume it was always meant to be. But it wasn't. For a long, long time, North America was a chaotic, multilingual, and multicultural space contested by global superpowers, indigenous nations, and ambitious colonists who weren't entirely sure which team they were on. The idea of a United States and a distinct Canada was not a foregone conclusion. Before the flags and the anthems, there were two very different colonial vibes happening in North America. To the south, you had the 13 colonies, which were mostly British, increasingly crowded, and buzzing with the radical ideas of the Enlightenment. Think town halls, fiery pamphlets, and a growing obsession with things like self-government and, let's be honest, making a lot of money without London taking a cut. Then you look north to the place the French called New France, and later the British called Quebec and Nova Scotia. This was a whole different world. It was vast, sparsely populated, and deeply shaped by its French Catholic roots. The economy was dominated by the fur trade, a sprawling enterprise that required cooperation, not conflict, with indigenous nations. The society was more hierarchical and traditional, organized around the seigneurial system of land tenure and the authority of the Catholic Church. When the British took over after the 7 Years' War in 1763, they didn't kick everyone out. They just sort of put a new layer of management on top of the old French one, which made things complicated, to say the least. The British victory in 1763 is a massive turning point. It put the entire eastern half of North America under a single crown, but it didn't create a single people. Instead, it created a problem. The British solution was the Quebec Act of 1774. This act guaranteed French Canadians their language, their religion, and their civil law. When the American Revolution exploded in 1775, the rebels thought they had a secret weapon, Canada. They sent emissaries, they sent pamphlets, they sent an army. They were convinced that the French Canadians, having been conquered by the British just a decade earlier, would jump at the chance for liberation. But they completely misread the room. The Quebecois clergy and landowners, the most influential people in the society, looked at the anti-Catholic rhetoric coming out of New England and the radical, chaotic nature of the revolution, and said no, thank you. The British Crown, thanks to the Quebec Act, was the devil they knew. It protected their way of life. The Americans, with their talk of liberty, seemed to threaten it. So instead of being greeted as liberators, the American forces that invaded Canada in the winter of 1775 to 76 were met with suspicion and eventually resistance. The invasion, led by figures like Benedict Arnold, before he was Benedict Arnold, and Richard Montgomery, was an utter disaster. Montgomery was killed in a failed assault on Quebec City during a blizzard on New Year's Eve, and Arnold was wounded. The starving, smallpox-ridden American army eventually retreated in disgrace. After the drama of 1812, things cooled down a bit, but the fundamental problem remained. British North America was a hodgepodge of separate colonies. Upper Canada, which was the Loyalist heartland, Lower Canada, the French heartland, and the maritime colonies like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. They had different laws, different economies, and honestly, a healthy dose of suspicion for one another. In 1837, frustrations boiled over into armed rebellions in both Upper and Lower Canada. These weren't grand, successful revolutions like the American one. They were messy, small-scale, and, well, quickly crushed. But they sent a massive shockwave to London. The British were terrified of a repeat of 1776. In response, they sent over a guy named Lord Durham to figure out what the heck was wrong. His report is one of the most important documents in Canadian history. He made two big recommendations. First, unite the two Canadas into one province to try and assimilate the French Canadians, which, spoiler alert, didn't work and was super offensive. Second, and more importantly, he recommended giving the colonies responsible government. This was a genius idea. This idea of responsible government slowly took hold, but by the 1860s, a new threat was looming: the United States. The American Civil War was raging, and the Union was building a massive, powerful army. This external threat, combined with internal political gridlock and the desire for a railway to link the colonies together, pushed the leaders of British North America to do something radical. They decided to form a country. Led by the shrewd, hard-drinking lawyer John A. Macdonald, they designed a new kind of nation. On July 1, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was born through an act of British Parliament, not through a declaration of independence. As Canada was quietly getting its act together through parliamentary procedure, the United States was in the throes of a much more aggressive and romantic national project: Manifest Destiny. This was the wildly popular 19th century belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. It was a powerful and frankly dangerous idea that fueled the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and the relentless push westward. From the American perspective, the existence of a separate, monarchical and British-linked entity to the north was an annoying anomaly, a historical loose end that needed to be tied up. This wasn't just abstract political theory, it had real-world consequences that kept Canadian leaders up at night. After the Civil War, there were annexation bills introduced in the United States Congress. Canada's response to Manifest Destiny was, in many ways, its own version of westward expansion, but with a Canadian twist. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's national policy was a three-pronged strategy to build a country from sea to sea before the Americans could swallow it up piece by piece. First, build a transcontinental railway, the Canadian Pacific Railway, a monumental and often brutal undertaking that would physically stitch the country together. Second, implement protective tariffs to encourage Canadians to buy Canadian-made goods instead of cheaper American ones. Third, encourage mass immigration to populate the vast, empty prairies of the West. It was a defensive, state-driven project designed to create an East-West economy and identity to counteract the powerful North-South pull of the continent. The story of westward expansion is central to the identity of both countries, but it played out in dramatically different ways, revealing the core of their contrasting national characters. In the United States, the Wild West was exactly that: wild. It was a story of rugged individualism, of gold rushes, cattle drives, and famous shootouts in dusty towns. The government's presence was often late to the party. Settlement frequently outpaced the establishment of law and order. This created a culture that celebrated the lone hero, the vigilante, and the idea that you had to make your own justice, a legacy that still echoes in American gun culture and political rhetoric today. In Canada, the westward expansion was a much more orderly, top-down affair. It was less wild and more methodically administered. Before settlers were allowed into an area in large numbers, the government sent in the surveyors to map out the land into neat grids, and crucially, they sent in the newly created Northwest Mounted Police, the forerunner of the iconic Mounties, to establish law and order before the settlers arrived. Their motto was Maintien le droit, which means uphold the right, and their goal was to prevent the kind of lawlessness that defined the American West. There were no epic gunfights like the OK Corral. The Mounties made sure of it. This contrast is perfectly captured in the story of Sitting Bull. After defeating Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, the Lakota Sioux leader and his people fled north to Canada seeking refuge. They were met not by an army, but by a handful of Mounties led by Inspector James Walsh. Walsh told Sitting Bull that in Canada, the Queen's Law applied to everyone, red and white alike, and there would be no raiding across the border. The story illustrates the fundamental difference. The United States saw indigenous nations as military obstacles to be defeated, while Canada saw them as a population to be managed and controlled by the state. The turn of the 20th century marked a major psychological turning point in the US-Canada relationship. The race for the continent was over, the border was set. The constant low-grade fear of American annexation that had dominated Canadian politics for a century finally began to fade. The two countries, having spent 100 years defining themselves in opposition to one another, slowly began to realize they had a lot in common. They shared a language, well, mostly a continent and increasingly a complex integrated economy. The rivalry started to cool, replaced by a grudging respect and a pragmatic need to get along. The two world wars were the great catalysts for this change. In both conflicts, Canada entered the war alongside Britain long before the officially neutral United States. But once America joined the fight, the two nations became indispensable allies. They collaborated on everything from military strategy to industrial production. The arsenal of democracy in the United States was complemented by Canada's own massive contribution of soldiers, pilots, and materials. This shared experience of fighting and sacrificing for a common cause forged a new kind of bond, one built not on suspicion, but on partnership. The image of the aggressive American invader was replaced by the image of the friendly GI next door. The Cold War cemented this alliance. With the Soviet Union looming as a common threat, cooperation became a matter of survival. This led to the creation of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, in 1958. This is an incredible thing if you think about it. The United States and Canada created a joint, integrated military command buried deep inside a mountain in Colorado, entrusting the defense of the entire continent to a partnership. The nation that once burned down the White House was now its essential partner in guarding against nuclear annihilation. It's hard to imagine a more dramatic reversal of a relationship. So how did we get from burning down capitals and plotting annexations to the modern reality of the world's longest undefended border? It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't inevitable. It was the result of a long, slow, and often painful historical process. The United States was born in a flash of revolutionary fire, creating a nation built on a radical creed of individualism and Republican liberty. It was a loud, ambitious, and expansionist project from the very beginning. Its story is one of dramatic breaks, of declaring independence and fighting for it, of remaking the world in its own image. It's a nation defined by its founding documents and its revolutionary ideals. Canada, on the other hand, is a nation born of evolution, not revolution. It was created defensively as a response to the American experiment. Its identity was forged not in a single glorious moment of rebellion, but through a series of pragmatic compromises and a stubborn refusal to be absorbed. It chose a different path: parliamentary democracy instead of a republic, constitutional monarchy instead of a presidential system, and a political philosophy of peace, order, and good government instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a quieter, more incremental story of building a country piece by piece, often by defining itself as everything the United States was not. The border itself tells the story. In the east, it's a jagged, natural line that follows rivers and mountains, the result of old colonial charters and the outcomes of wars. But as you move west, it becomes the famous 49th parallel, a perfectly straight, abstract line drawn across the continent by diplomats. That line represents the moment when rivalry gave way to negotiation, when the two countries decided it was better to agree on a border than to keep fighting over one. It's a testament to the triumph of diplomacy over conflict, a conscious decision to manage their differences and coexist as peaceful neighbors on a shared continent. Ultimately, the story of the United States and Canada is a tale of two siblings who took very different paths in life. One was the rebellious, outspoken firebrand who left home in a blaze of glory. The other was the more cautious, pragmatic sibling who stayed closer to the family, building a different kind of life through patience and negotiation. For over a century they were rivals, defined by their differences, but eventually they grew to understand and respect each other, forging an alliance that has become a model for the world. Their shared history, full of conflict and near misses, is precisely what makes their present-day friendship so remarkable and so strong.